Welcome to the world of Aedyr, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello, fellow Kith, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode. I'm so excited that you guys are joining me on this journey. Or if you're tuning in for the first time, thank you for joining in. In this podcast, we aim to bring all the news and lore as it's pertinent to the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian's upcoming game, Avowed. And for those who aren't aware of why we're pairing Pillars of Eternity and Avowed together, it's because they share the same fantasy world. They share the same universe called Aedyr. And so, as the theory goes, if we dive into the history, lore, and mechanics of the Pillars of Eternity games, we can gain insights into Avowed as it undergoes development, and then we'll all have common ground of knowledge to move on once the game's released. In today's episode, we're going to be going over the second half of Aedyran history. The Aedyr are a culture of people that we see lots of influences of in the reveal trailer for Avowed, which is why we started this series in the first place. So join me in this episode as we look at the other half of Aedyran history, which leads to the beginning of the colonization of a continent known as the Eastern Reach, which is the actual setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game. We'll be laying down the groundwork for events that happen immediately before the game. Since we don't have any news, we can dive straight into the lore.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
In today's episode, I'm going to be reading exclusively from one of the in-game books from Pillars of Eternity 1, titled The Aedyr Empire Part 2, Expanding Borders. And so as we read through this, I'll leave little comments here and there and some speculations as to what it might mean and give you guys the information so that you understand who the Aedyran people are and what influence they had in establishing the colonies in the Dyrwood, which is what their colonies will become known as. Here is the start of the book. In 2602 AI, so that's only roughly 200 years after they formed as an empire, Aedyran explorers returned from over the ocean, telling tales of the ruins and treasures there and of expansive fields that were perfect for growing Vorlis. Vorlis is the plant that grows, which you use to make purple dye. Just like in our own Earth's history, the purple dye trade is a big trade to get into. It's big money. Purple dye is mostly used with royalty. It's the most expensive dye to make. It's the hardest one to find. And so that's why it's considered a commodity. If you are a big name in the purple dye industry, you have a lot of money. And this is true in our own history. People hundreds and hundreds of years ago that were in the purple dye industry were making big money. The explorers warned the Fairconing that the locals were not friendly to outsiders. As a reminder, the word Fairconing is Aedyran for first king. Now, I find it interesting that they point out that the locals were not friendly to outsiders. And we do know, which I think we might learn in this book, that those quote-unquote outsiders, the Glonfathans, they really didn't like these foreigners coming from the other side of the ocean and just pillaging their holy sites, their sacred caves. But just a sentence ago, these explorers returned telling tales of the ruins and treasures that they have found. So I wonder if the outsiders were not friendly because these Aedyrans were constantly trudging across their holy sites. Anyways, continuing on. The Fairconing, seeing this as an opportunity to extend his empire and secure trade on another continent, sent more explorers. Now this is in line with what we've seen Aedyr be like in the past. In the first history book, we noted the multiple times that it was mentioned about how Aedyr grew as an empire and that it had seized economic power and that it had established great trade routes. And while we didn't get any details about these things, it did tell us that the Aedyr really valued being in these kind of positions of power and having this wealth at their feet. I mean, what nation wouldn't want those things, right? I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's worthwhile noting that this does come up a lot in this Aedyran literature. Over the next 20 years, the area that would become the Dyrwood was investigated, mapped, and colonized. In 2623, the first permanent Aedyran colonial settlements were established. So merely 21 years after the report of this continent existing across the ocean, they had a permanent colonial settlement. Vorlas fields were set up north of the forests of the Dyrwood. But between the conflicts with the Glonfathans, which is the name of the locals that live there, and the War of the Broken Stone, it floundered. Now, we have to back up a second here and explain what the War of Broken Stone is. As a setup to it, the tensions between the Aedyran colonists and the Glanfathams were very high. I mean, these Aedyrans were coming over from the other side of the ocean, and they were constantly going through all these holy and sacred sites to the Glanfathans. The Glanfathans would say, hey, don't do that. That's ours. That's our holy sites. Don't go there. But the Aedyrans, they kind of stormed in anyways. And to make matters worse, the Aedyran people actually started taking Glanfathans as slaves. Now, this complicated history went through ups and downs of peace and non-peace, but it all sort of erupted around 2626 AI when the War of the Broken Stone actually happened. Now, it was called the Broken Stone War because there were these Aedyran colonists that were plowing some land for farming, and in the process accidentally knocked over a thing of Aedyr, which is a very unique material and crystallized kind of like stone in the Aeoran world. We'll go more into detail that on another episode. I did touch on it in episode 1, though. Regardless, it was a rock, it was a stone, it was a crystal considered important to the local natives there. And when this farmer, innocently enough, broke this stone, war erupted as a result. It was just sort of a boiling pot already. Like everyone was mad at each other, tensions were high, and this was just the straw that broke the camel's back. But because of that one broken stone, war erupted. And that's why it's called the War of the Broken Stone. So now, returning back to the history of Aedyr, we had just said that there were Vorless fields set up, but they floundered due to the War of the Broken Stone. It wasn't until 2643 that the opportunity presented itself again, that is, to have more fields of Vorless. Some Aethasian pilgrims wanting to escape persecution established colonies and Vorless farming operations in the territory of Raed Saris. Now, as a quick review, Aethasian pilgrims, those would be pilgrims who follow the faith of Aethys, Aethys being one of the gods of Eora. Aethys is the god of redemption and of dusk and dawn. He was very attractive to a lot of the colonists in Raed Saris because of his ideals towards redemption. Whereas in Aedyran culture, as we learned in the last episode, they really, really valued purity, and they did not hand out redemption very easily. It was not easily come by. And so for these colonists, it was quite an attractive faith. So these Aethasian pilgrims, they went north to Raed Saris to establish colonies and Vorless farming. With Grand Valia on the verge of collapse, that's another culture of people we'll talk about in the future, the Fair Koning wanted to ensure his hold on the purple dye trade. He encouraged the settlement, that is, of Raed Saris, and even paid to have the pilgrims set up in the New World. So the Fair Koning, the first king of Aedyr, was really looking to cash in on this, the fact that these Aethasian pilgrims were going to set up Vorless fields and that they would be able to give him money for the purple dye trade. Now, even though worship of Aethys is probably, we don't know for sure, but probably common in the Aedyran culture, the worship of Woodica was far more common, and in fact, the Church of Woodica and the government of the Aedyran Empire were united together. So Aethasian pilgrims would not have been considered part of the state church, if you will. Because the Fair Koning was still trying to secure his name in the purple dye trade, he was unable to properly respond to Admeth Hadrit when he issued his ultimatum. Now, this has to do with something else that is going on. The entire history of this area known as the Eastern Reach, where the Dyrwood is plagued with wars between the Aedyran colonists and the Glanfathan natives, and Admeth Hadrit was essentially one of the Aedyran leaders of the colony. During the progress of several different wars that were going on, which we will touch on in a different episode, Admeth Hadrit issued an ultimatum to the Fair Koning back in Aedyr, essentially asking for independence so that they could be recognized as their own nation. But the Fair Koning was too distracted by the purple dye trade to properly respond to this ultimatum, and he inevitably had to give in to some of Admeth Hadrit's demands. He expands further in this book here. To avoid a rebellion and leave himself time to oversee the Vorless farms in Raed Saris, the Fair Koning relented and made Admeth a Gref Palatine, which is the official title he gave him that allowed them to have some independence. In return for this concession, Admeth spent time and resources on the Dyrwood's trade and shipping routes, benefiting the Fair Koning with increased income. So the Fair Koning got what he wanted, and the Dyrwoodans got what they wanted. They got a little bit more independence, and the Fair Koning got money from the purple dye trade. Seems like everyone's happy, right? For 7 years, the Dyrwood provided Aedyr with a steady income, leaving the fair Koning time to ensure his trade system in Reseris was strong. So remember, in Raid Ceres is where the Aethasian pilgrims went to establish farming for Vorlas. With the fair Koning's attention elsewhere, Admeth instituted the quote-unquote 10 years treaties, ending slavery in the Dyrwood and permanently removing one of the revenue sources provided by the Dyrwooden explorers. This is mind-boggling when you think about it. Like, the reason for all of these wars occurring, well, at least one of the many reasons, especially a big one, is that the Aedyrians were taking the local natives, the Glanfathans, a lot of which were these small Orlan people, they were taking them as slaves and forcing them to work. I mean, why weren't you expecting there to be war and conflict breaking out? I don't know. It's a little shameful that I guess it took this long for them to reach that point. But thankfully, Admeth Hadrit, he instituted this 10 years treaty and ended slavery. But unfortunately, as we read further in the book, the artifacts from the ruins scattered throughout the Dyrwood. So the artifacts referencing the holy objects and holy relics of the Glanfathan people. At this point, the fair Koning's word meant almost nothing to the citizens of the Dyrwood. So he's starting to lose control of his own colonists, his own people that are on a different continent. They've already got a little bit of independence, and they're just starting to dissociate themselves from the fair Koning back in Aedyr. Admeth Hadrit had replaced him as their true leader. In order to undermine Admeth's standing, the fair Koning found allies willing to explore the ruins, which was against treaty conditions, and to plunder them. Soon, Aedyr again had a supply of artifacts to sell. When his agents were eventually caught, the fair Koning distanced himself from the operation, certain there was no way to link him to the proceedings. So now get a load of this guy. I mean, Admeth Hadrit has established these peace treaties so that the people who were formerly slaves and these Aedyran colonists coming from another land, who essentially they live there now, they can't just pack up and leave or go across an ocean. It's not that simple at that time. He establishes peace, or he at least establishes the foundation for peace. But this fair Koning, whoever it was in charge at the time, greedy for more, sends people willing to break the treaty to go explore the areas that are considered holy to the natives and steals stuff from them. And then when they inevitably get caught, he distances himself. He risks everything that the Admeth had worked for just so that he can have more gain. I mean, at this point, the Dyrwood are distancing themselves from the fair Koning anyways, so from his point of view, he's probably thinking, why not just do what I want regardless? But thankfully, the Griff, that is Admeth Hadrit, using means provided to him by his Glanfathan allies, so that's good, he's got allies in the native tribes now, discovered the evidence needed to prove the fair Koning was behind the plunderers. The conflict that arose from this revelation led to Admeth declaring independence for the Dyrwood in 2668 AI. So that is just 66 years after Aedyran explorers came back to announce they had found a new continent. That is merely 45 years after the establishment of the first permanent settlement. So in that amount of time, they've had multiple wars, they've had these tension and conflicts with the Glanfathans, and constantly, there was slavery going on and they were plundering holy sites. And now there is a conflict that arose. They finally declare independence as their own nation, the Dyrwood, in 2668. After a bloody 4-year-long war that resulted in the death of Admeth, the fair Koning relented. Trying to keep control of the Dyrwood had become too costly. He signed treaties with the new Duke of the Dyrwood and returned his attention to Raid Ceres, redoubling efforts on the Vorlas trade, which was still running today. And so there you have it. The fair Koning really only gave them independence once it started costing him too much, not because he felt it was the right or wrong thing to do. Now again, I'm probably reading into a lot of this history based off of our own, and it's hard not to do that. But I mean, this is a fictional world that was created by people who know the same things, right? And so it's hard not to make the relation between those two things. I wonder what sort of parallels Josh Sawyer and his team drew from history of our world when developing the history of Aedyr. Regardless, they finally established independence, and they went from the title of Gref Palatinate to Duke. And so now they have their independence and they are their own nation. And it is the nation of the Dyrwood that actually is where the first Pillars game takes place in, which means we have essentially laid the groundwork to explore this new area of the world that is important to the Pillars of Eternity games. So at some point, it might start with the next episode or it might start later, We're going to start a series looking at the history of that area, looking at the events that really lay the foundation and the groundwork for the Pillars of Eternity game to even happen. Some of the wars that go on there and some of the political strife and some of the people that we find there as well. So it's very pertinent to the Pillars of Eternity games. But there have been some people messaging me saying that there is a high interest in looking at the deities of the world as well. So I'm considering jumping into a series on that. Anyways, that's all the lore that I have for today. A shorter episode than the one last time. But I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please feel free, and actually I encourage you to leave a rating and a review. Not only does it help me to do a better job and to know what to keep doing, it helps other people find the podcast as well. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can always reach me on Twitter at World of Aedyr, or on Reddit, my username is Gingerino. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you next time.